The light failed first, not all at once, but in small, unforgiving steps, one beam dimming, another flickering, until the cave no longer felt like a place but a closing mouth, and as cold water crept around their boots and the ceiling pressed lower than memory allowed, Mark realized with sudden clarity that panic would be useless here, because this was not a problem to solve. It was a clock, and it had already started. It was July 4th, 1985, and the sound of rain above the limestone did not yet seem important. Mark Holloway and Ethan Price had chosen the cave for its reputation, not its danger. Donaldson Cave was known as accessible, forgiving if respected, a place many entered and left the same day, and that familiarity gave them confidence as they stepped inside that morning, the air cool and steady, the stone walls damp but calm, the cave breathing slowly around them as if indifferent to their presence. Their equipment was basic but intentional. Helmets secured, lamps switched on, spare batteries counted once instead of twice, a small shortcut in preparation that felt harmless at the time, and as they moved deeper, the daylight thinned behind them, replaced by narrow beams cutting through darkness, reflections shimmering on shallow water beneath their boots. Every movement echoed back in distorted fragments. What neither of them could see was the rain upstream, miles away, ordinary summer rain pouring into sinkholes and cracks, feeding channels that led directly toward the passages ahead. And when the first ripple brushed against Mark's ankle, it felt insignificant, almost expected. Part of the cave's nature, not yet a warning, not yet a threat. They continued forward because stopping felt unnecessary, because turning back felt premature, and because caves reward motion more often than hesitation. And behind them, the entrance still felt close enough, wide enough, forgiving enough. A retreat that did not yet carry urgency. Not yet. Not until the water rose again. Colder this time, faster, deep enough to change the sound of their steps and the tone of their breathing. Ethan was the first to stop, not speaking, just lifting his light toward the ceiling, watching droplets gather and fall. And in that shared silence, the cave changed. No longer a place to pass through, but something active, patient, and utterly unconcerned with their plans. And the truth settled between them without drama or panic, heavy and unavoidable. They were no longer exploring. They were being tested. The water did not rush at them. It advanced with patience, sliding along the stone as if it belonged there more than they did. And Mark noticed it rising not by sight, but by sound. The echo changing, footsteps losing their hollow ring, replaced by a dull, swallowed splash that made distance hard to judge and time harder to trust. They turned back together, no discussion, just a shared instinct that moved their bodies before doubt could speak. And at first, the retreat felt manageable, familiar turns appearing where they expected them to be. But the cave had already begun to rearrange itself, reflections doubling passages, shadows bending corners, and what had been a clear route inward now felt narrower, lower, less willing to let them pass. Ethan slipped first, not falling but enough to send a sharp sound through the chamber, water surging briefly around his knees, cold biting through fabric, and he laughed once, too quickly, the kind of laugh meant to keep fear behind the teeth, while Mark watched the water line on the wall, marking it without thinking, then marking it again moments later, realizing it had climbed. They reached the first low section where earlier they had ducked without concern, and now Mark crouched and felt the ceiling brush his helmet, closer than memory allowed. The beam of his lamp cutting across rippling water that no longer hugged the floor but filled the space between stone and body, and he understood then that every inch mattered. Every breath had weight. Behind them, deeper in the cave, something shifted. Not a sound, exactly. More a pressure, as if water were finding faster routes, older routes. Channels carved long before either of them existed. And when they pushed forward, the current tugged at their legs with a quiet insistence, not strong enough to stop them, but strong enough to remind them that balance was temporary. Ethan reached the next bend and stopped, his light sweeping across a wall that looked wrong, too smooth, too blank, and he turned slowly, eyes wide but focused, saying only one word, calm but edged. Mark. And in that single syllable was the understanding that they were no longer certain where the exit was. They tried one passage and met deeper water, another and found it sloped downward instead of up, each correction costing seconds, each mistake making the water feel colder, heavier, and Mark felt his breathing shorten, not from panic, but from calculation, from the steady realization that the cave was now dictating pace. When one lamp flickered, just once, then steadied, neither of them spoke, because acknowledging it would give it power, and so they moved faster, clumsier, boots scraping stone beneath unseen currents, hands sliding along walls slick with limestone and silt, and somewhere above them rain continued to fall, indifferent, feeding a system that did not know their names. They reached a chamber they both recognized too late, a place they had passed earlier without stopping, now filled higher than before. And as Mark stepped forward and felt the floor drop unexpectedly beneath him, water surging to his waist, he realized the cave had closed a door behind them, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony, and there would be no reopening it. Mark did not shout when the water took his balance. He locked his jaw and spread his weight, hands slamming against stone that felt alive with motion, and when he steadied himself, he realized the floor he remembered no longer existed in the same shape. The cave had erased its own memory, smoothing edges, filling gaps, turning certainty into guesswork. Ethan waded in beside him, breathing hard now, the sound sharp and close inside his helmet, and together they tested the chamber inch by inch, feet probing downward before committing, because falling here would not mean pain, it would mean being pinned, water pressing chest and throat, stealing time in seconds instead of minutes. They chose a narrow side passage, one that sloped upward, barely, the kind of incline you only trust because you want to believe in it. And as they forced themselves through, shoulders scraping limestone, water climbing to their ribs, Mark felt the current change, not faster, but more focused, threading through the gap with intent, pulling at loose fabric, at ankles, at the space between steps. The ceiling dropped again, forcing them to crawl, and now the water touched their chins when they lowered themselves, lips brushing the surface involuntarily, the taste sharp and mineral. And Mark counted movements instead of breaths. One hand forward, knee, shift, pause, repeat, because counting breaths made him think about how few he wanted to take. Behind them, a sound traveled through the passage, not loud, but unmistakable, water forcing itself into places it had not reached before, filling chambers they could no longer see, and the cave responded with creaks and distant knocks, the language of pressure and release, and Ethan's light shook as his hand cramped, fingers stiffening in the cold. They reached what should have been a break in the passage, a small rise where earlier they had stood and adjusted gear, but now it was submerged, the high point erased, and Mark felt something fragile inside him tighten, because landmarks were how you stayed oriented, how you convinced yourself you were still moving towards something. Ethan spoke then, his voice controlled but thin, asking if Mark remembered the left turn after the squeeze, and Mark said yes, even though he wasn't sure, because doubt spreads faster than water, and they needed direction more than accuracy, at least for the next few steps. The squeeze came suddenly, the walls narrowing without warning, forcing them to turn their heads sideways, helmets scraping stone, and Mark felt his pack catch, fabric snagging, water pushing him forward while the cave held him back, and for one long second he was neither moving nor breathing, just suspended between pressure and dark. He forced himself to relax, exhaling slowly, twisting just enough to free the strap, and when he slid through the other side, his legs shook uncontrollably, not from fear alone, but from the effort of holding the body still when every instinct demanded speed. They did not stop, because stopping invited shaking, and shaking wasted heat, and as they moved on, Mark noticed the time without looking at a watch, felt it in the way thoughts shortened, in the way the cave felt closer with every step, and he understood then that survival here would not be dramatic or fast. It would be a series of quiet choices made under pressure, where the wrong one would not announce itself until it was far too late. The passage widened just enough to let them stand again, and that small mercy felt almost dangerous, because standing made them believe in progress, and belief could be careless. But Mark forced himself to slow, hands pressed to his thighs, lungs working hard against the cold weight in his chest, while the water continued to rise around them with a steadiness that felt deliberate. They reached a bend where the current split, one stream sliding past their calves toward a darker channel, the other pushing straight ahead, and Ethan hesitated, light hovering between the two like a question with no answer, because both routes looked familiar in fragments, and neither looked right as a whole, the cave offering pieces without context. Mark chose the straighter path, not because he was sure, but because it climbed by inches, and inches mattered now. And as they moved forward, the water dropped slightly, enough to expose slick stone beneath the surface, enough to make footing uncertain again. And twice Mark felt his boots slide, catching himself only by slamming his palm into the wall, skin burning through wet fabric. The air felt different here, thicker, warmer by degrees so small they almost imagined it. And that change carried hope and danger in equal measure, because warm air could mean higher ground, or it could mean a pocket with no exit, and the ceiling above them lowered again, forcing them to bend, then crouch, then crawl, the cave narrowing with a familiarity that felt cruel. Ethan's breathing grew louder, less controlled, and Mark knew the signs: cold tightening muscles, fatigue dulling precision. And he reached back, gripping Ethan's sleeve once, not pulling, just reminding him of presence, of rhythm, of forward motion, and they moved together again, synchronized more by necessity than trust. Then the light failed properly, not a flicker this time, but a clean, final darkness from Ethan's lamp, the beam collapsing into nothing, and the space around them shifted instantly. Distance erased, walls felt instead of seen, and Mark heard Ethan inhale sharply, the sound caught and held before being forced back out. Mark did not speak right away. He reached into his pack by feel, fingers clumsy, numb, counting items by touch, and when his spare light came on, the cave returned in fragments, smaller, harsher, shadows sharper than before, and he saw Ethan's face pale beneath the helmet, eyes fixed and wide, but still focused. They did not redistribute gear, did not debate options, because debate wasted heat and time, and instead they pressed on with one light, one narrow cone of vision cutting through moving water and stone, and Mark became acutely aware of how much they had relied on redundancy, on margin, on small comforts that no longer existed. Ahead, the passage dipped again, the water rising toward their chests, and Mark stopped at the edge, shining the light across the surface, trying to read depth by reflection, by color, by instinct, and he understood then that they were approaching a point where turning back was impossible, not because the cave blocked them, but because their bodies would not survive the effort twice. He looked at Ethan, said nothing, and stepped forward, committing weight, breath, and time, to water that closed around him without resistance, and as it reached his chest and climbed higher, he felt the last thin layer of choice peel away, leaving only movement, only endurance, only the quiet, relentless requirement to keep going. The water closed around Mark's ribs and kept climbing, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to force posture into calculation, shoulders hunched, chin lifted, light held high as if elevation alone could bargain with the cave, and every step forward felt like a negotiation with unseen ground that might vanish without warning. The passage narrowed again, funneling them toward a darker throat where the ceiling dipped close to the surface, and Mark slowed instinctively, sweeping the beam low, watching the waterline kiss stone overhead, measuring space not in distance but in breaths, because breaths were the only currency left that mattered. Ethan touched his arm once, not to stop him but to signal awareness. And when Mark looked back, he saw the change in Ethan's eyes. Still alert, but dulled at the edges, the cold beginning to tax judgment. And Mark understood that leadership here was not direction, it was pace. It was keeping movement just slow enough to remain deliberate. They reached a low arch where the water pooled higher, the ceiling barely a foot above the surface, and Mark crouched, testing depth with his boot, finding nothing solid at first, then a ledge, then a sudden drop, and the knowledge settled heavily. This was a duck under now, whether they named it that or not. Mark spoke then, calmly, deliberately, explaining what he saw, what he guessed, what he did not know, because clarity steadied the body even when certainty was impossible. And Ethan nodded, swallowing once, adjusting his grip on the wall, preparing himself for water over mouth, over nose, over instinct. Mark went first, lowering himself until the water pressed against his lips, then his cheeks, then his helmet rim, and he tilted his head back just enough to keep the beam clear, sliding forward inch by inch, exhaling slowly to keep panic from compressing his chest. And for a moment, the cave became nothing but pressure and sound, the rush of blood in his ears louder than water. On the other side, the ceiling lifted slightly, enough for him to rise and breathe, sharp and controlled. And he turned immediately, holding the light steady as Ethan followed, slower now, movements stiff. And when Ethan surfaced beside him, the relief was brief and incomplete, because the water behind them surged, closing the gap they had just passed through. They did not wait to see if it would seal completely. They moved forward, boots scraping blindly, hands dragging along stone slick with silt. And Mark felt fatigue begin to hollow his muscles, not exhaustion yet, but the warning of it, the promise that strength would not be infinite. Somewhere ahead, the cave opened slightly, air shifting again, warmer, carrying a faint echo that suggested space beyond the next turn, and that hint pulled them onward, fragile and dangerous, because hope could sharpen focus or dull it completely. And Mark knew they were approaching another threshold, not just in the cave, but in themselves, where survival would depend less on finding the right path and more on enduring whatever waited at the end of it. The space ahead widened just enough to let sound return, a hollow echo that made the cave feel taller than it was, and Mark felt the shift immediately, the way you sense a room before you see it, the air moving differently, the water losing some of its urgency as if pausing to decide where to go next. They stepped into a chamber no bigger than a garage, the ceiling higher here, uneven but merciful, and both of them stopped at once, not to rest, but because stopping was unavoidable. Legs trembling, hands numb, breath coming in short, disciplined pulls that burned the throat, and for the first time in hours Mark allowed himself to stand fully upright. The water here reached mid-thigh and held, swirling lazily around their legs, and that stillness was unsettling, because still water meant accumulation, and accumulation meant this place would not stay passable for long, but for the moment it gave them seconds, maybe minutes, and Mark used them carefully. He scanned the chamber, light tracing the walls, counting exits, two visible, one narrow and sloping up, the other broader but darker, dipping slightly before vanishing, and the floor between them was cluttered with rock and debris, signs of past floods, of the cave's memory written in stone. Ethan leaned against the wall, eyes closed briefly, jaw tight, and Mark knew the signs well enough to worry, cold fatigue creeping into the muscles, slowing reaction time, making simple tasks expensive, and he spoke quietly, keeping Ethan engaged, asking questions, naming details, anchoring him to the present. They checked time by instinct, by the way hunger whispered, by the ache in joints, and Mark realized with a dull shock that they had been inside far longer than planned, that the cave had quietly stolen hours without ceremony, and above them, unseen, the rain had not stopped. A sound rolled through the chamber then, low and distant, water forcing itself through a new route, and the still pool around their legs began to stir, rising again by degrees too small to argue with, and Mark knew the pause was ending. He chose the narrower passage, not because it felt safe, but because it climbed, and climbing meant air, meant gravity working in their favor, and as they entered it, the ceiling dropped again, forcing them into a crouch, the walls closing like hands that did not care how tired they were. The passage twisted sharply, light bouncing wildly, and Mark felt his foot slip, catching himself hard, pain flaring in his calf, sharp enough to steal breath. And for a moment, the fear was not drowning, but injury, because injury here would be final in quieter ways. He pushed through it, refusing to test the leg, refusing to acknowledge damage until it mattered more, and ahead, the passage rose another inch, then another, and the air felt cooler again, fresher, and that change pulled at them like a promise. But the cave was not finished, and as they rounded the next bend, Mark saw the water ahead filling the passage almost completely, a low ceiling, a dark surface, and he understood with sudden clarity that the next choice would not be about direction at all. It would be about whether they were willing to put their faces fully under the cave and trust that it would give them back. The water ahead was still, too still, a dark mirror pressed up against stone, and Mark knew that stillness was deceptive, because somewhere beyond it, the cave continued, which meant the water had somewhere to go, and that somewhere was already filling behind them. He lowered himself slowly, testing the ceiling with the back of his hand, finding only inches of space between surface and rock. Not enough to keep a face dry, not enough to pretend this was anything other than a full submerge. And he felt the quiet resistance inside his chest, the instinctive refusal that rises when air is about to be negotiated. They spoke quickly, efficiently, agreeing on order, on signals that would be useless once submerged, but comforting to name anyway. And Mark adjusted the light, angling it forward, knowing visibility would collapse the moment he went under, knowing the beam was more reassurance than tool. He took one breath, not deep, just sufficient, and eased forward, water closing over his mouth, his nose, his eyes. Sound flattening instantly into pressure, and the ceiling brushed his helmet as he pushed, hands sliding along stone he could no longer see, only feel, counting movement instead of time, because time did strange things underwater. The passage pinched, tighter than expected, and his shoulder caught briefly, panic flaring sharp and immediate. But he forced it down, exhaled a fraction, twisted, and slid free, trusting that Ethan would find the same space, trusting that the cave would not shift again before it was done with them. When Mark surfaced on the other side, the air felt violent, tearing into his lungs, and he turned at once, holding position, light shaking in his grip as he watched the water behind him ripple, then break. Ethan's helmet emerging, then his face, eyes wide but present, breath coming in hard, uncontrolled pulls that slowly steadied. They did not celebrate, did not linger on relief, because relief was dangerous here, and as Ethan gained his footing, the water surged through the submerged section behind them, rising faster now, claiming the space they had just occupied, erasing the option of return with decisive force. Ahead, the passage climbed sharply, water thinning around their knees, then their ankles, then gone entirely, leaving slick stone and aching legs, and Mark felt his calf protest again, a deep, sour pain that suggested strain or worse. But he pushed through it, because pain that still allowed movement was a luxury. They climbed until the sound of water dulled behind them, until breathing slowed enough to feel intentional again, and when they finally stopped, it was not because they were safe, but because their bodies demanded it, muscles shaking openly now, heat bleeding away into damp clothes. Mark checked the light, battery weaker, beam dimmer, and did the math without numbers, without optimism, understanding that survival was narrowing into a smaller and smaller set of acceptable outcomes, and somewhere above them, unseen and unmoved, the rain continued, feeding a system that would not stop simply because they had endured this much already. They moved again because standing still invited shaking, and shaking wasted heat. And as Mark led them upward, the passage tightened into a winding climb that forced short steps and careful placement, every slip punished by a sharp reminder from muscle or bone, every breath carrying the damp taste of stone and effort. The pain in Mark's calf sharpened, no longer ignorable, a hot line pulling tight with each step, and he adjusted without comment, shortening his stride, shifting weight, because naming the injury would make it real in ways they could not afford yet. And Ethan followed, matching pace, saying nothing, the rhythm between them quiet and necessary. The light dimmed another degree, not enough to fail, but enough to announce its future, and Mark angled it carefully now, conserving movement, letting shadows exist where they could be tolerated, focusing only on the next few feet, because thinking beyond that felt indulgent. They reached a ledge and stopped, not planned, just forced by exhaustion, and Mark sank onto the stone, back against the wall, legs trembling openly now, and for a moment the cave felt almost still, water sounds distant, muted, as if held back by the same paws gripping them. Ethan checked Mark's leg with quick, practiced hands, fingers pressing gently, and Mark clenched his jaw as pain flared bright and immediate, the muscle tight and angry. Not torn, but close enough to warn, and Ethan nodded once, understanding exactly what that meant. Movement still possible, margin reduced. A low sound rolled through the cave then, deeper than before, water finding another route, another shortcut, and the air shifted, carrying a faint, cool draft that raised both hope and fear at once, because drafts meant space, but not always the kind that let out. They followed it, slow and deliberate, the passage sloping upward, then leveling, the floor dry now but slick with residue, and Mark felt a cautious optimism begin to form, fragile and dangerous, because dryness felt like progress, and progress tempted speed. Ahead, the passage split again, one branch tight and rising, the other wider but sloping down, and Mark hesitated, longer this time, studying the stone, the debris lines, the faint marks left by past floods, and he chose the tighter route, because down meant water, and water was no longer negotiable. The squeeze tested them, shoulders scraping, pack snagging, and Mark had to remove his pack entirely, pushing it ahead by inches, breath controlled, movements precise, while Ethan waited behind, patient but cold, fingers stiffening against stone. When Mark emerged on the other side, the space felt different immediately, higher ceiling, cooler air, and he lifted the light, heart hammering, revealing a chamber larger than any they had seen since entering, the walls rising into shadow, the floor sloping gently upward. But there was no daylight, no obvious exit, only another space to cross, another decision to make. And as Mark stood there listening to his own breathing echo back at him, he understood that survival was no longer about finding the way out quickly. It was about staying capable long enough for the cave to finally allow it. The chamber carried sound differently, each breath returning to them delayed and distorted, and Mark felt exposed in the open space, as if the cave could now watch them think, and thinking was dangerous when the body was already negotiating pain, cold, and dwindling light. They crossed the chamber slowly, angling upward, boots scraping grit and calcite, and Mark kept his eyes on the walls, reading them the way he'd been taught, searching for scallops, for flow marks, for any sign of how water preferred to move, because water always told the truth after the fact. Near the far side, the draft strengthened, unmistakable now, brushing damp hair, lifting the fine chill on his skin, and that change sharpened everything, because air movement meant connection, meant space beyond this space, but it also meant vertical distance, climbs that punished weakness without mercy. They found the climb where the draft disappeared upward into darkness, a rough chimney no wider than shoulders, streaked with mineral stains, the stone worn smooth in places where water had climbed before them, and Mark felt the weight of the decision settle fully. This was not a detour. This was the route. Ethan went first this time, lighter, steadier on the wall, and Mark watched carefully, tracking every movement, memorizing the holds, because his calf would not forgive improvisation, and when it was his turn, he moved slower, testing each placement, forcing the muscle to obey through pain that now felt hot and constant. Halfway up, his foot slipped, not far, just enough. But the jolt sent a sharp pulse through his leg that stole breath and thought together, and for a moment, the only thing keeping him in place was the pressure of his back against the stone and Ethan's voice below. Calm, steady, pulling him back into sequence. He rested there, pressed into the rock, counting breaths until the world narrowed again to manageable size, then continued, inch by inch, until the chimney opened abruptly into another passage, and he rolled onto the ledge beside Ethan, chest heaving, light shaking openly now. They lay there for seconds that felt earned, listening, and Mark realized the sound of water was distant, muted, no longer rising with them, and that realization was dangerously close to hope, the kind that could make a body spend energy it did not have. The passage ahead sloped upward and curved, and as they followed it, the air grew cooler, fresher, unmistakably so, carrying a scent that was not stone or water but soil, leaf rot, the faint organic signature of the surface, and Mark felt his throat tighten around a breath that almost broke discipline. Then the light flickered again, longer this time, a warning without urgency, and Mark understood the final truth settling into place. They had endured enough to reach possibility, but not enough to waste it, because the cave had tested their limits thoroughly, and the last stretch would not forgive a single careless step. The passage narrowed again, not enough to stop them, but enough to demand attention, and Mark moved with a care that felt almost ceremonial. Every step placed, every breath counted, because the light was now a fragile thing, dim and yellow, the edges of the world dissolving faster than he liked. The air grew stronger with every turn, unmistakable now, carrying damp earth and something else, the faint, impossible hint of outside, and that scent did something dangerous to their discipline. It pulled their thoughts forward faster than their bodies could follow, and Mark forced himself to slow, because this was where people made mistakes, close enough to safety to forget the cave still required payment. The floor angled upward sharply, then leveled, and suddenly the ceiling lifted, not high, but higher than it had been anywhere else, and the darkness ahead thinned into a softer gray that did not come from the lamp. And Mark stopped so abruptly Ethan nearly ran into him. They stood there, frozen, listening, and through the sound of their breathing came something else, distant and wrong inside the cave. A faint metallic echo, irregular, not water, not stone, and Mark felt his pulse spike, because caves did not make that sound on their own. It came again, clearer this time, voices, distorted by rock and distance but undeniably human. And Ethan laughed once, sharp and broken, a sound that surprised both of them, and Mark felt his throat tighten so hard it hurt. He shouted then, not loudly, not recklessly, but with everything he had left, his voice scraping raw against the stone, and the reply came back stronger, closer. Names he did not recognize but did not need to, because meaning did not require detail anymore. They moved toward the sound, stumbling now, not careless but spent, and when the passage widened into a final crawl, Mark dropped to his hands and knees, dragging his injured leg without argument, light flickering dangerously as if aware its job was nearly finished. Hands reached him first, gloved, steady, gripping his shoulders, anchoring him to something solid and certain, and as he was pulled forward into colder air and brighter light, he felt the cave release him. Not gently, not kindly, but completely, as if it had finished asking its questions. Outside, rain fell softly through trees he could barely see, night pressing close, and Mark lay on his back, breathing air that felt unreal in his lungs, while voices surrounded him, calm and efficient, and somewhere behind them the cave continued to fill, indifferent as ever. Later, much later, someone would say they had been trapped for nearly 57 hours, and Mark would nod, accepting the number without feeling it, because time inside the cave had not moved in hours or minutes. It had moved in decisions, and somehow, against all expectation, they had made just enough of the right ones. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.